responsible budget that has been hailed and appreciated for the kind of sensibilities that have gone into the budget. To understand the thought process behind what is being described as a very conservative budget, I have with me Mr. Somanathan. Mr. Somanathan, thank you very much for joining us on Money Control. I have to begin by asking you the first question. This is the budget where we're seeing some sort of a withdrawal of the fiscal stimulus. If you look at the numbers, in terms of capex spending, we've seen a very modest hike. In terms of allocations for some of your own flagship schemes, we are seeing no increments or a very modest, if at all. So, how are you very confident that for the year FY25 you will see the growth and that will that will take India through?
So I wouldn't really connect the two statements about growth and taking India through and the fiscal. I think the fiscal stimulus being withdrawn is a counter-cyclical necessity. I think, in fact, the error that many economies have made is to inject a stimulus when it is necessary and then not to withdraw it when it is no longer as necessary as it was. And this means that you don't have firepower for the next round of something that may happen. And things do happen from time to time. So I think it's a matter of basic economic prudence to withdraw a stimulus when the conditions that led to the stimulus no longer exist to the same degree.
Okay.
The stimulus was started at a time when growth was negative, not when we were talking about whether it's 6.5% or 7 or 7.5%.
Sure.
And I would also say that 6.5% growth is not low. We live in a very different world where trade is constrained and geopolitical situations are difficult. 6.5% growth itself would be high, not low. So I think to say that would this be enough for growth? I think with what we have presented in this budget, I'm very confident that we'll achieve one of the world's highest rates of growth. And I think what's been presented is sufficient for that. Now, should it be even higher? Of course, we'd like it to be higher. But we also want to consolidate. So I think we've prepared a judicious mix of fiscal impulse and fiscal consolidation. And I think this is what we think is the right balance for the times.
Okay, so at the moment, consumption growth is between 3%.
I have one quarrel with something you said. I think it was not a modest increase in capital expenditure. I would suggest it was a significant increase because we've presented an 11% plus increase on the last year's budget, with the GDP having grown only 8.9%. So this will be yet another year when both as a share of the budget and as a share of GDP, capital expenditure is going up. And it's going up beyond a very high expansion in the previous 3 years.
So the markets were expecting an over 15% hike.
I don't prepare budgets based on market expectations.
Sure,
we don't even read them when we prepare our budgets.
Fair enough. No, so at the moment, consumption growth is at between 3 to 4%, and private sector investment is yet to pick up. So you're banking right now. The strategy, if one were to look at it, if you, like I said, markets were expecting a 15% increase, but we are seeing an 11% increase in capex. So there is a sense that you want the private sector to come forward now. And
but let me say this, without the private sector coming forward, quote unquote, we have achieved whatever great growth rate we've achieved this year. We will continue to be spending more next year than we've spent this year. Our total expenditure is going up next year and capital expenditure is going up 11%, not down. And in real terms, capital expenditure is rising. In real terms, our budget is larger. Therefore, I don't think we are doing anything that will restrain growth to be below what it was this year.
Sure.
What private capital expenditure can do is to increase growth even further.
Sure.
So with or without that entry of private capital expenditure, I think we have enough to sustain today's growth rates.
Okay. So any estimates that you're working with on private sector investment?
I would not hazard guesses on that. I mean, those are, look, I think it is for the private sector to take those decisions. We can incentivize, we can encourage, we can, suggest that they should do. Ultimately, they have to take their decisions because they have to live and profit or not profit by their own decisions. So I don't want to hazard a guess on what those amounts will be. But I expect it to be positive. We have a number of production-linked incentive schemes which are already operational. We expect more of them to take off in the coming year. So with or without those schemes, I envisage a lot of capital investment from the private sector. There's a mention in the budget about 1,000 aircraft being purchased. That's entirely in the private sector.
Right.
And while the aircraft may be imported, there's a lot of associated capital investment that you need if you're going to use 1,000 extra aircraft in terms of ground handling, domestic, equipment and staff. And so it is happening. Capital investment is happening.
And consumption, what's your outlook?
I'm not looking at consumption per se. No.
So I'll tell you why I'm asking.
We are protecting the consumption of the poor, and we're doing enough to do that. Beyond that, I think it's for market forces to determine what consumption should be. The government is focused not only on consumption but also on saving. So, we need to do both.
Okay.
So I don't have a view on whether consumption should increase by reducing saving, or consumption should not increase and saving should increase, or I don't have a view on that. Mm-hmm. I think the government will take the steps necessary to protect the consumption of the poor and the vulnerable, and that has been done.
So for PM Kisan, we did not see any increase in allocation. For Manrega also, what was the thought process behind that?
Manrega is a demand-based scheme. PM Kisan is a scheme which has universal coverage. So all the farmers who need to be covered are being covered, and they'll continue to be covered.
So you did not feel the need for an increase in allocation,
no.
Considering this is
all
looking like a poor
funds
agriculture.
Have alternative uses and opportunity costs. We have deployed the funds in the way that we think is best for the economy. Please remember, this budget has spoken repeatedly about making India a developed country by 2047. We are focused on running that marathon. Now, running that marathon requires a fit India, and fiscal fitness, not physical fitness, but fiscal fitness is very important for that marathon. And therefore, we have focused on deploying fiscal resources optimally in the pursuit of that long-term goal.
Which is becoming
Viksit Bharat by 2047.
2047, right. So, under your expenditure head, there's a 70,000 crore allocation for new projects.
Yes.
What is that for?
That consists of partly, so we had announced this new fund for research and innovation, a corpus which will be created. That's a multi-year proposal. It's not that the 1 lakh crore will be invested in the coming year, but the provision for that is part of that 70,000. We have also kept aside a sum of money to be given to those capital investment departments that need it the most. So we have not pre-allocated it to railways, highways, telecom, power, defense, etc. But this sum is available to be taken by those who have the greatest need for it. So it is something that will be dynamically allocated during the year.
So how will you decide the allocation?
We've done this before in 2022-23. This allocation, if departments say, look, you've given us this much, we need more because we have this requirement, we'll allocate this amount. But it is operationally convenient to keep it in the Department of Economic Affairs rather than pre-allocate it to a particular demand, after which it becomes difficult to reallocate to someone else. It's much more difficult to move money between ministries than to keep it in the finance ministry and allocate it to whoever requires it.
In terms of your gross borrowings from 14.1 lakh crore, the expectation was that it will be a 15.5 lakh crore number. How have you come to this number?
So, without getting into the exact numbers, the number is lower than perhaps was expected, because you may recall that in the year 2020-21, the government came up with a way of maintaining GST compensation to the state governments despite the shortfall in cess collections.
Right.
That involved the central government borrowing a large sum of money with the understanding, and this is agreed by the GST Council, that this would be paid to the states and eventually those borrowings would be repaid from GST compensation cess. The first round of redemptions is due in the coming year. We intend to, as per the arrangement that was agreed upon, those redemptions will happen from the GST compensation cess and not from the consolidated fund. And in addition, we expect that there will be more money in that fund than just to redeem these securities. So we may also look at advancing the settlement of those debts. But these are debts which are incurred for GST back-to-back loans. So those loans will not need to be repaid by fresh loans. They'll be paid from the GST compensation cess. So therefore, there's a divergence between what may have been expected and the way it's actually going to be done.
Sure. Okay. Moving on, the speech talks about a demographic challenge, and there's going to be a white paper that's going to be worked on.
No. White paper is different. The demographic.
There's a committee.
Yes, that's right.
There's a committee. I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. There's a committee that's going to be set up to look at the challenges of demographic challenge. Can you tell us a little bit more?
I'm afraid I don't have too much detail on that subject. It's the budget speech is a document which reflects a lot of departmental priorities. I wouldn't be able to tell you much on that.
Okay. And with this budget, Mr. Somanathan, what's the signaling effect that you want to give to the markets, to the RBI? Because there's an expectation now that the monetary policy could or should or
there is
follow.
no intent to send any signal to the RBI or to anyone else. I mean, the intent is to tell you what we intend to do, how we intend to spend our money, how much we intend to receive and spend. And I think too much attention to signaling is sometimes a bad thing, because we should focus on doing what we think is right. The signal, I mean, the content is the message. So there's no intention to signal anything to anyone here.
Okay, fair enough. I just want to get a sense from you, what are the key growth drivers that you see driving the economy in FY25, considering we've seen somewhat of a withdrawal, we've seen subsidies also go down, we are seeing, so what according to you will be...
See, first of all, let me say, on subsidies going down, that doesn't result in any negative impact on consumption in the economy, because these subsidies are basically, look, whether it's the food subsidy, they're not changing the price of food. So nobody is going to consume less food because the food subsidy is slightly lower. That reflects the fact that this year there are some arrear payments for old food subsidies. So it's not a reduction in anything. Fertilizer subsidy, we are not changing the prices of any fertilizer. So the subsidy change reflects changes in input costs of imported fertilizer. Again, that doesn't affect the domestic economy at all. So some of these revenue expenditure changes have no negative effect on consumption in the economy. So that's just one point. Growth impulses, I think the continuation of government's capital expenditure and continuation of at least current levels of private capital expenditure,
Right.
I think are enough to sustain the present level of growth.
All right, I want to talk about the disinvestment target, 50,000 crore. And
That's not a disinvestment target.
So what is the disinvestment target for this year?
There is no disinvestment target
Why
for the coming
is that?
year. So this is a sort of conscious change where we now look at disinvestment as one element in a strategy for managing the government's assets. In fact, the department is called the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management. These public assets, the government's equity holdings in various enterprises, can be a source of capital receipts through disinvestment. They can be a source of dividends if we don't disinvest. They can be a source of impetus to the economy through capital investment. And all these three purposes are important. Focusing on a particular disinvestment target, the Secretary Deepam has explained this yesterday. He is of the view that having this target creates an expectation of a necessity to sell shares by some fixed arbitrary financial year end. And this actually affects the valuation of shares and doesn't give us the best value that we can get.
But currently, if you look at the market cap, and India's disinvestment strategy has remained somewhat consistent from the time when the market cap was 50,000 crore to now when it's looking at 50 lakh crore. So it's a huge... So one would think that the market conditions are ripe right now, and you might want to...
They are ripe right now because we didn't disinvest something 2 years ago. If we had disinvested then, we wouldn't be able to take this ripe thing now. So the point is that we are looking at a more integrated strategy where decisions are not taken by short-term fiscal priorities. They're taken based on maximizing the value of our investments and not based on having to fill some gap in the budget by having to dispose of certain shares at certain points of time. So it's a composite target of disinvestment, monetization, everything together is the 50,000 that you see.
Okay, so one would think that the government perhaps is rethinking about its strategy to offload stake in PSUs.
I'm not aware of any policy change. This is a change in emphasis. It's a change in the link between fiscal management and public asset management. The two used to be intertwined in terms of we used to rely on that as a source of financing our budget. We are now looking at that in a different way. We are saying, look, that is incidental. Go and maximize the value of the asset. What we get from it is good if we get something, but we are very happy to get dividends too. So we don't want to look at only, selling the cow. We are also happy to take the milk and sell it. And so it could be the dividends, it could be the asset. What's the best time to sell something should not depend on the budget strategy. It should depend on the conditions in the industry, the conditions in the market, and various other things.
Okay. I have a question on...
But it is a fact that we are de-emphasizing disinvestment as a source of fiscal resources. Yes.
Okay, but it was not only as a source of fiscal resources.
True.
It was a broader direction that you were giving out to the private
Absolutely.
sector, to the
and I
world
think that
at
is the
large.
more important dimension than the fiscal resources. Absolutely agree with you on that.
Okay. I have a question on...
That remains important, and that's
Okay.
something the government, I think, will continue to follow its outlined policy. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question on Paytm. Paytm is has one of the biggest market shares in terms of on the merchant side of UPI. Around 10 million merchants use it to accept payments. Now, with the action of RBI against Paytm, what kind of disruption are you expecting?
I'm afraid that's not a subject on which I know enough to give you. You probably know it better than me.
No, but I was hoping
I wouldn't be able to say much on that. It's a regulatory action on which I have no great. I have no value to add on that.
Well, okay, I'll take your answer for that. My last question to you is, Somanathan, we heard the finance minister yesterday say that they're going to come back and present a big budget in July. This was a very fiscally prudent budget. Like I said, it was nothing like what any of us were expecting. Was that the vision with which you all started work on, or did it require some sort of, backroom negotiations to come up with this financial statement?
The budgets are always made in a very deep process of dialogue between departments, different institutions in the government, and this budget was no different from any other.
So the direction that let's stick to the script, let's stick to convention, did it come from anybody, or was this completely...
Well, there was a clear political direction that we should stick to conventions.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Somanathan. It was a pleasure talking to you as always.